All right, and thanks for joining us. My name is Kelly Hoyland. I am the IMS Higher Ed Program Director. I'll be serving as your host for this IMS CLR Roundtable. And at this point in time, I would like to introduce the team from Johns Hopkins University who are really going to share a great story about using their CLR to help across their institution. So we have Janet Schreck, who is the Associate Vice Provost for Education, Chadia Abras, who is the Director of Institutional Assessment, Rita Doust, who is the Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning, and Paul Huckett, who is the Associate Dean for Learning Design and Innovation. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Janet. So thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Kelly, and good morning, or hopefully it's morning for everyone still. Good morning to everyone joining us. So I think it's pretty funny that I saw there was only one person also from academic affairs, and you're being sort of inundated with an academic group this morning, but that's actually part of our story that we will tell you. So hopefully it will give a new perspective to a conversation I think that's been driven primarily up till now by registrars and technology individuals. So our hope for today, we have quite a few slides that we're going to share with you, and we hope to have some discussion. But we'd like you to be able to walk away understanding our visioning process and thinking about how that relates to yours at your institution, in the sense that we have a number of stakeholders that we've involved in the discussion. So I think walking away thinking about how you can employ a similar approach would be great. Also, thinking about your organizational culture. I'll set the stage in the context for Hopkins, and you'll learn that we have a very decentralized culture that can be leveraged strategically to be able to solicit buy-in. And then we also hope we're going to help you think about how the comprehensive learner record can address a number of questions and sort of dynamic shifts that are happening in higher education around how we deliver our education, how we assess learning, and how we help establish value for education. So just in terms of how we're going to operate, I'm going to start off and I'm going to give you kind of the 30,000 foot view, both the context of the sort of the question at hand for Hopkins, and then also the broader sort of higher ed question that's driving some of the discussions about CLR. I'll then hand off to Shadia, who's going to talk about our actual CLR implementation project. And then she will hand off to two of our colleagues from our schools. Paul's from the School of Engineering and Rita's from the School of Nursing, who will give you a lot more of the boots on the ground, idea of the conversations that are happening amongst faculty there. And then hopefully we'll have time for discussion, and we definitely will have time to address your questions and answers. So with that, I think we're going to kick off with just sort of setting the stage and the context. And I want to start with a disclaimer right away, which is that we don't have all the answers. We are just beginning our journey in CLR, as I think most people across higher education are. And so we're going to, be very honest and transparent with some of the successes we've had, but, a whole chunk of questions and potential speed bumps we still see ahead. So first, a little bit about Johns Hopkins, if you're not familiar. So we are a private Research One institution. We're a really relatively large school in terms of our graduate population in particular. So you can see we have about 6,000 undergraduate students, but we have, depending on which data source you check, anywhere between 20 and 30,000 graduate students who range from part-time master students all the way up to PhD students. We have 9 schools at Hopkins. The 9 schools are very different in terms of their makeup and also in terms of their culture. So just to give you kind of a sense of the range, we have as most universities do, a School of Arts and Sciences. We have a School of Engineering. We also have a business school, a School of Education, School of Nursing, School of Medicine. We have a public health school. And then we also have an international studies school, and we have the Peabody Conservatory, which focuses on music and dance. So wide range of academic cultures. We're incredibly decentralized. And I sometimes have jokes and banter with my colleagues as I go to different conferences across the nation, because everybody says they're decentralized, but I don't think you can really understand decentralization until you come to Hopkins. So we operate under what's called the RCM budget model. And for those that aren't familiar, that's known as the responsibility centered management of budgeting. So essentially what that means is that the dollars really rest within the schools, and truthfully, actually, really the budget and dollars rest down at the level of the faculty and the departments. And so there is a lot of incentive for them to want to innovate and manage their revenue streams well. And what that means is that the Provost Office, where I sit in the central administration, we don't have a very big budget. In fact, we have a pretty small budget in terms of the size of the university, because the budget dollars sit within the individual schools and programs. That creates a lot of that decentralized culture I talked about, where the individual schools, we kind of joke that it's like a federation in some ways, that we have our 9 schools and kind of a loose federation. And I'm sort of the part of the central government that tries to, control that a little bit, but really actually just allow the schools to really prosper and do what they need to do. So we have this decentralized culture. And then I would say even within each of the 9 schools, there are a lot of subcultures. So if you think about a professional school, for instance, versus a primarily undergraduate focused school, we also have, the medicine culture kind of versus the not medicine culture. We also have different kinds of graduate students. We have some that are part-time, professional students who are working full-time and taking classes part-time. And then we have others like our PhD students who tend to be fully immersed in their studies on a full-time basis. So quite a broad range of cultures and people. We're also geographically dispersed across Baltimore and Washington, but actually we have several international campuses as well. So we're a big school to kind of wrap your head around. Next slide, Shadia. So that's kind of the landscape of Hopkins. In terms of the higher education landscape, I think one of the things that I bring to the table is I sit in the provost office. Part of my portfolio is being responsible for helping to innovate in education across the schools. And in order to do that, I have to constantly monitor what's happening in the schools, at Hopkins, and then also kind of across the broader arena of higher education. And I don't think I probably need to do a lot of time with this group about what's happening across higher education. But there are a number of disruptive forces that are driving change. And changing an institution that is higher education, that doesn't change quickly. So many of these have been discussion points for a long time that I think have been now accelerated because of COVID and because of what a lot of us have had to go through in the past year and a half in terms of rapid changing in response to the situation evolving. But these disruptive forces all lead to discussions around the comprehensive learner record. So things like, the cost of higher education, changes in what our consumers, meaning our students and parents and employers of our future students, are expecting to receive in terms of their education delivery and content when they're with us. Information's everywhere. So being able to figure out better ways to harness information and to really utilize technology to be able to provide that to our customers and our stakeholders is important. So thinking about really sort of antiquated structures like the transcript, right, or the diploma, which are tend to be very paper-driven, one-time snapshots of a potentially very dynamic interaction with the university. There's a big push for us to start to really question how robust is that as an answer for what our students are looking for. And then, of course, there's a changing nature of jobs and career paths for our students. We know that, the traditional models of sage on the stage, I'm going to give you all this content, isn't really what students are looking for, or employers are looking for in this day and age of ubiquitous information and constantly evolving jobscape. So all of those things are driving conversations in higher education and at Johns Hopkins. So just to point to a couple of initiatives, again, because I sit in the Provost Office, I kind of sit at this 300,000 foot view and can see all the different initiatives happening across the university. And I actually have a chance to sit back and try to think about how they converge. So there have been several that have really, I think, driven the CLR discussion. One is the Q2, we call it, which is the Second Commission on Undergraduate Education. This was a 3-year, really hard look at our undergraduate curriculum. And that group of 30 plus faculty and staff and administrators and students produced a report that basically called for the first time creation of a set of foundational abilities for our undergraduates. It really asked us to re-examine how we're delivering both breadth and depth. So if you think about higher education, a lot of times we talk about depth of a discipline, and that's where a lot of R1s tend to land, is we like to have our students dive deeply into the discipline they're studying. But we know that they need these 21st century skills to be able to go out and successfully be employed. And so that really pulls in the breadth question. So this led us to offer some recommendations around re-examining what we're requiring for our majors and providing students more room to take things outside of the depth piece of their major. And we also introduced an entitlement for something called the Hopkins semester, where a student can actually create kind of their own semester of in-depth study of something in a potentially experiential way. The other recommendations that came out of that are meaningful incorporation of co and extracurricular learning. So really trying to recognize that a lot of learning occurs outside of traditional coursework. And again, those very archaic kind of structures we have in place where, you know, it's a course or it's credits. And then also we decided to re-envision our advising and mentoring model. So all of those things really help contribute to the conversation around CLR. Kind of at the same time, or maybe about a year in advance of that, we actually had a university-wide discussion about the desire to purchase an assessment management system that was university-wide. So again, because of our decentralized history and culture, typically what we see is most divisions would have purchased their own assessment management system. And in fact, we had 3 or 4 different systems in place at the university. But the group that oversees learning assessment for the university decided there was great merit and opportunity in procuring one university-wide system. So we spent some time on an RFP and ultimately selected ATHIS as our system for that. And that has also driven our ability to have university-wide conversations about comprehensive learner record. Just quickly, 2 other emerging initiatives. One has also been around for multiple years, and that's the Student Services Excellence Initiative, and we call it SSEI. So we have a strategic plan initiative called One University. And that again speaks to the decentralized nature of Hopkins. So we were hearing from our students that as they would cross from school to school, they could really perceive the barriers and kind of the silos we had inadvertently created around each of those opportunities. And it was really not beneficial to them, and in some ways was actually deterring from their experience with us in terms of their education. So for example, if they wanted to register for a class or a course outside of their own division, it was incredibly difficult to do. It involved like a triplicate carbon copy, paper form that had to be signed by 3 different people. So those are the kinds of things SSEI has been addressing. Part of the SSEI initiative is also developing what we're calling a 360-degree view of the student. So really being able to harness technology for our students so that they can kind of get the information from all these different systems and potentially different programs in schools and bring it together to give both us and the students this 360-degree view, which again, really matches well with the comprehensive learner record. And then we have this emergence of what we're calling the lifelong learning approach at the same time. So lots of discussions and requests from our schools to explore things like how can we stack credentials for people. So we have a lot of individuals who kind of come and go and interact with Hopkins in different ways. And right now we treat those all discreetly and separately, and we don't really have a good mechanism to allow them to really show the whole picture. And that includes credit for prior learning for many of our professional students who've been working for a time. So next slide, Shadia. You'll see this slide again when my colleague Paul presents. I stole it from him, borrowed it from him with permission. But this is an example of what we mean by lifelong learning, that we may have a student who does all of these points with us at some point during their interactions with Hopkins, where they may take some workshops and do some single courses. They might participate in one of our MOOCs. They might actually have completed a bachelor's degree and decide they also go back and do a master's degree and potentially go on for a doctoral degree. And we just haven't had a good way to be able to really represent all of those touch points in a unified way that makes sense. And that comprehensive learner record really helps us drive that conversation. So for me in the Provost Office, the CLR has given us many challenges that are great opportunities for us to drive forward difficult conversations we've been trying to have at the university. One around how do we create a culture of assessment? You'll hear later that the comprehensive learner record doesn't work if you don't have really good, meaningful assessment of learning happening in the programs. So we know that the CLR challenge is an opportunity for us to be better at our assessment practices. In particular, we're starting to really tackle this question of how do you build assessment structures for things that happen outside of traditional coursework. So how do we build assessment structures for our co-curriculars and extracurriculars? A great example is our undergraduate research. Our undergrads often pick Hopkins because they want to engage in research. And we haven't really been able to consistently provide them a meaningful record of that opportunity when they're with us. So that's I'd say a current conversation that's going to take quite a few iterations till we get to where we want to be, but it's a great opportunity to tackle that. We have a couple of other challenges that we're dealing with, including a gigantic ecosystem of software. We have, and I know my registrar friends will understand this, we have software for catalogs, we have software for, our learning system, we have our Blackboard LMS system, we have our student information system, we have a career platform, we have all these systems that we keep picking up new systems, but I think we're starting to really see the importance of managing those and determining which system is actually the system of record for different pieces. So again, a great opportunity to engage with multiple stakeholders across the university to really talk about that. And then finally, we're really working to talk about sort of the guardrails for how we approach things like badging or alternate credentials in a way that allows us to ensure that we stay true to our brand at Hopkins, which we work carefully to maintain, and that we stay compliant with our state, regulators and our accreditors, but that we still afford the opportunity for innovation. This whole idea of these alternate credentials is a really challenging question for higher education that requires multiple people to be at the table, not just the registrars, but the faculty who are responsible ultimately for that delivery as well. So leading into Shadia's slide, I think what I'd like to highlight is, in the Provost Office, I don't have much direct authority at all. And I know, Paul and Rita will give a nod to this. It's not really helpful when the Provost Office goes out to a school and says, you must do X, Y, and Z. Because of our decentralized culture, the initial reaction is, no, we won't. No, we're not going to do that. And, we have our way of doing things. So central administration isn't really going to tell us what to do. So my biggest sort of superpower is the ability to convene and to really work from the bottom up and try to get all the stakeholders in the room to be able to really see where the vision aligns and where there is an opportunity for shared resources and shared vision that will actually promote the work of the divisions and the school together. And so what we find is that means, first of all, being able to work across all these different groups I have listed here. So these are different task forces and committees and councils that we have standing, and different groups that I'm able to access and convene to be able to have these conversations. And then what we really try to do is just set the guardrails, right, for the journey. It's not about telling divisions what to do or schools what they can do and can't do. It's about sort of setting the basement level of, here's the minimal expectation we expect everybody to have in common. And here's kind of the guardrails of where you can't go without exiting off the road and getting in trouble. And aside from that, we want you to go forth and then innovate within that in whatever way makes sense to your culture. So that's where we're doing a lot of the hard work of really boots meets the ground of how do we get some of these minimum standards set up. So to tell you more about that part, I'm going to actually hand it off to Shadia, who's going to talk to you about our APHIS and our CLR implementation project.
Hi, everyone. So to tell you more about the engaging the community at Hopkins and how we use the CLR as a focal point and a point of discussion to make everybody interested in the process, we are going to start with a blueprint. The blueprint that we used for, somehow it's not appearing. Okay, we first decided to develop a competency-focused learning outcomes, basically for us to be able to engage around what the endpoint is, which is the CLR, is we have to start building the blueprint and the building blocks for the CLR to really function well. And we engaged all the schools around developing these competencies. And we also engage around the design and the development of the programs themselves around these competencies, whether curricular or co-curricular. We also developed and aligned, we're currently, the schools are developing and aligning assessment plans to these competencies and outcomes. And eventually all of it will be collected into the system, whether for reports or for the CLR as a whole. The CLR itself is going to be the mechanism by which we are tracking lifelong learning journeys of the students, starting with courses, curricular, co-curricular, digital credentials, outcomes, rubrics, and assessments, which are being built as we speak by the divisions and by the non-credit options within those divisions, and experiential learning. We are connecting all this through mapping and alignment to assessment and program outcomes and course outcomes and or activity outcomes and objectives. We are also, the endpoint is going to be the authenticated achievement, endorsed achievement, and self-issued as achievement by the students. So authenticated will be part of their transcript, basically what they've done in the courses, and it's something they cannot control. Endorsed achievement could be what Janet just said about the research, undergraduate research piece, which is something that is not driven by a specific course. It's more of an activity that they participate in, and faculty could give them evaluation on their outcomes, and that could be part of the CLR. And also self-issued, anything that they have done, whether you're at Peabody and you're doing a performance there and you want some employer or a school to see what you're doing for you to showcase your ability, that will be part of the self-issued. All of this starts before they come to Hopkins, while they're at Hopkins, and continues after they have left Hopkins. It's a lifelong learning journey for them. The CLR implementation is, the goals are for us to engage the whole community at Hopkins. And as Janet said, that's a power we have, is to engage. not to dictate or say what should happen, is engage the community in a conversation. And once they are engaged, they feel like they are part of the conversation and nothing is being dictated. It's all coming from every school's needs, every division's needs and what they need to accomplish. We want to create a culture of assessment, but actually it's more of a culture of improvement. The word assessment can box us into, well, that's all we're doing is assessing. No, we're using these assessment practices for improvement in the end. And apply the CLR value chain that you just saw earlier to lifelong learning, to create a process for best practices, whether for curricular or co-curricular, and definitely engage the students in their curricular and curricular records. It will become theirs to showcase. We started with the stakeholders. And luckily, some of these committees already are standing committees, as Janet said earlier. So the Council for Learning Assessment was part of the APHIS committee, steering committee that involved additional people like the Provost Office, Registrar. CER is our Center for Educational Resources, Institutional Research, Central IT, Student Services, which has several arms like lifelong learning and life design and the student affairs. We also have representatives, several representatives from each of the schools and the divisions. And then we had student representation on that committee. That committee formed the success plan and the vision for the APHIS implementation. How do we go forward? Then we created a task force, which additionally to the people on that committee, added instructional designers, instructional technologists, faculty, and program coordinators. And this group don't sit at the JHU level. Each school has its own instructional design team, its own instructional technologist team, its own faculty body, and its own program coordinators. So they had reps that they decided should be in that space. And the task force meets regularly. The committee decides on what is going to be presented to the task force, and mostly it's training, implementation, application of resources, or if something didn't work out, how do we go back and look at it and look at how we implement it. And these people are going to, the designers, the technologists, faculty, and program coordinators are going to take that knowledge to their divisions. And that's the trainer piece, where at each division, they are responsible for implementing all what we had decided to do through that committee, and then flow back up to see where they are in that process. We are also looking at creating an advisory group that will inform not just the APHIS work groups, the task force, and the steering committee. So that is being discussed, whether it should be an APHIS advisory group or an SSEI, where all technologies are under that same umbrella. The implementation projects involve all the academic programs. So each one of the schools have decided which program it's going to start with to implement, including Medicine, Peabody, Whiting, Nursing, School of Ed, and Krieger. You are going to see two examples here from Whiting School, Engineering, and School of Nursing. We are also carrying a non-credit pilot that involves several of the schools, and the non-credit pilot is going to determine in the end, or actually guide a committee that is going to be formed around creating guardrails around what is credentialing at Hopkins, what does it mean, what should it involve, what should the competencies look like, and what does a badge mean, and how to make sure that it has meaning in learning as well. We also have the experiential learning and student affairs arm that is, they are looking at their outcomes currently and their activities and what should go into the system. But also the PhD programs are not implementing their curricular activities at this point, not just yet. They are more working around activities that they had created for PhD students, where they give them professional development and certifications, and they teach them how to be good teachers or how to do research. It's more extracurricular activities, and those programs are being discussed and will be implemented in the system at first. The divisions that are engaged around the CLR, and actually Janet and I have been going around the university, and she's presenting around the notion of the CLR. What is it? And that has engaged and really made everybody very interested around what's going on, because the vision of the CLR somehow creates a common view of where we're heading, where we are, and what we have in common as a university, and basically creating a record of the student learning and journey, whether at Hopkins or beyond. So the academic programs are part of that, which are the schools, the 9 schools. The experiential learning piece, which could be student services, could be life design, could be student affairs, and the Provost Office also, they engaged around that, and were really interested in how this vision can put everybody under the same umbrella. And the last group that we're going to talk to is the advising group, and that's coming up soon. The implementation project timeline, it depends on the division. For the academic programs, they have between June 2020, which was the actual day we started the implementation, and we're hoping by 2023, July, we are collecting data in the system. The implementation and the plans, project plans, are division specific. They come up with their plans, we put them in a common area in teams where they can track them and where they can update them if something happens or didn't happen. Then we have the non-credit pilot, which is short-lived. It has Carey Business School, AAP, Whiting, School of Nursing, and School of Ed, where they're presenting one course in the pilot, but then that pilot itself is going to inform how we're going to connect the CLR and to their LMSs or not, or whether they will go on the university LMS eventually. That's not to be decided. It will be decided. And also, as I said, the guardrails around what these non-credit credentials and badging mean. Then we have the experiential learning time frame. We started that piece, and it follows the academic piece only because we are trying to make sure that all 3, academic programs, non-credit, and experiential learning should all talk, because those outcomes should come from the mission and vision of each division, flow up to the mission and vision of the university, and also connect all together on the learning outcomes of the students, whether curricular or co-curricular. In that, I am going to hand it over to my colleague, Rita Daust, who is an associate dean at the School of Nursing, and she was going to tell you about this journey at the School of Nursing.
So thank you for joining us. And it is very much a journey at the School of Nursing. I've been involved in academic leadership for 25 years, whether at a program or at an associate dean. And what we're going to be embarking on is something that, as we think about the marketplace, what our students ask for, what is it our accrediting bodies ask for, those are the pieces about why we're committed to this journey. And we're early in our journey. And one of the things that I will say is you will see that we have an approach of rapid cycle improvement. We try one thing, how do we tag? Course learning outcomes, program learning outcomes, how did it work? How do we look at measurements? But everything right now is a series of journey and ultimately a shared direction. We also recognize we've already taken a couple of different pathways, and we're likely to continue that. So the School of Nursing It's nursing, unlike some of the other schools where you have separate degrees for different programs. In nursing as a health profession, you have degree programs with multiple tracks. So we have pre-licensure, which is, again, we're an entirely graduate school, is at the master's level. But then we also have leadership and advanced practice. So as we consider those components, we have 5 programs, 5 separate degrees, both with our master's entry, the specialty, our doctor of nursing practice. You will see the multiple advanced practice, not just the leadership, but whether it's a nurse practitioner, clinical nurse specialist, or nurse anesthetist. Each one of these have their own specialty accrediting beyond the professional accreditation and beyond the university. So we live by regulations, and as we look at those. But then also what we find is that nursing, we have executive education. So we have professional programs. And those are either things that are for practice, for the research that we have from individuals, such as our Chicago parenting programs, or they could be professional training programs, such as our clinical research. But what you'll see here, of those 19 programs, I've listed a few of the major areas. Our students are typically we will say you have to engage students, and usually at Hopkins, we have to slow them down a little bit. They're very socially conscious, they're very active. And so what you'll find is that the number of co-curricular activities that they engage on are simply incredible, but we don't capture that anywhere other than perhaps a student CV. But what we do have is incredible academic activities, things that the students actually participate in. And it could be something from a research honors program. It could be our special student interest groups, such as palliative care, where they actually will partner with the Cambia Foundation and host a series of events. And then, of course, are the other pieces. So when we look at these academic activities, I always say to myself, well, how did the students capture that? So I had a major project looking at an area, we call it the 4th P, which is advanced procedures and diagnostic and clinical procedures. So whether it is inserting a chest tube, other kinds of things. The students who participated, all volunteer, never were able to show that other than the publication of an article. They could not demonstrate the fact that they used a software for systematic review or surveying schools or developing a required course. So these types of things we want to say is, how do we give our students, other than on their degree that it says Doctor of Nursing Practice, master's degree, Johns Hopkins, how do we capture the richness of the activities? But then also what we have is the alternate credentials. So whether you're looking at MOOCs or other kinds of pieces, the pre-exposure prophylaxis training for preventing HIV, whether it is living with dementia, it is alcohol in terms of the SPURT programs, other types of things that our individuals may engage in that are continuing education courses, such as the Armstrong Institute for Patient Safety, where they can take courses, but yet they have no way to have that reflected and validated. So what we want our complete learner record and what our partnership with APHIS is how to collect and catalog all of these, and that they can be reported and used to generate samples. So think of this as we're on our pathway to a digital degree, but in this suitcase are all of those components. But as we've heard from Chadia, it's not only the assessment, but it's the validation of that. So one of the pieces for us in nursing was capitalizing on the change. And that timing and culture are everything when you try to capitalize on initiatives and synchronize efforts. So first of all, at the university level, we had the APHIS initiative going on. For also examining new learning management system. And also, given COVID, we've had to pivot for our on-site programs to pivot online with on-site clinical or the growth of online courses, especially at our doctoral level, the clinical doctorate, not the research doctorate. So while we were all doing that in nursing, we also established new nursing curriculum guidelines for academic programs. And this went to a competency-based approach. So whether it is at the pre-licensure or the advanced, all with the exception of the PhD, the research degree, all must be competency-based. But the other component that we have going on in terms of all of this confluence is the accreditation outcomes. The accreditation outcomes for us by the Collegiate Commission on Nursing Education no longer just wants program level outcomes. They are asking specifically for individual level. How do you track that individual across? And how does that individual look? And I thought to myself, I don't know. But I know here at Hopkins, we will figure that out. And so for us, that's not aspirational. That actually is required. And then also, as we think about the changing, the online pivot for programs typically that are face-to-face, given with this regulatory pieces, we're also regulated at boards of nursing. So for us, we were interested in how is it we're going to be able to demonstrate not just the theory courses, but the clinical and the performance assessment. And that is critical. And that is where a complete learner record, as we heard Chadia talk about validation, assessment and improvement, but the validation. So one of the pieces that we found with us was moving, while there were some opportunities for collaboration, many actually at Johns Hopkins, but because of the decentralized nature and each division just being so exceptionally strong within their own, we really had to start building bridges across our schools. And so we realized that we had unique differences as well as quite a bit of similarities. And so you'll hear from my colleague, Paul Huddick, that at the Whiting School of Engineering, they have a structure of distinct academic programs. They also have programs for practicing professionals as well as academic entry. And they worked on developing standard syllabi and also having online programs. The School of Education had multiple degree structures, yet they had similarities with us in terms of whether it's clinical or teacher preparation learning, field learning, as well as a required professional accreditation for the program. The School of Nursing, as I mentioned, we have one clinical doctorate program, the DNP, with multiple tracks. And each one has their own accreditation, God bless their soul. And so as a result of that, and I have been involved in assessment, evaluation, regulatory pieces, the information exists somewhere, is always the story. But pulling it together and accessing it becomes the difficult. So through the regular meetings, we learned with and from each other. We held similar visions, which is the validation of informal, of non-academic learning, and why. Value differentiation. You can have a degree from anywhere. And while a degree from Hopkins will give you brand reputation, you really cannot understand what those things were as much as from your own institutions. So we needed to be able to have that value differentiation. It's a competitive marketplace. None of us can rest on our laurels. And we have a choice that either you can lead, you could follow, you could catch up, or you could shut down. We're choosing to lead because in order for us to attract the kinds of students, we need to have that. But the other pieces we've learned now is discussions about purchase power, whether it's software, whether even in our informal learning. Perhaps we can offer a slate of courses, of programs from Johns Hopkins University to an organization. We've talked about course availability, and we've also talked about the future credentials. Friday, 9 of my doctoral students defended their proposal. And motivational interviewing. Well, are you certified or are you delivering content? I'm certified. Well, where does that show? It doesn't. We can show our clinical research preparation as well, and I'll talk about that in a moment. One of the biggest changes, I believe, for our faculty is faculty think in terms of content, not outcomes. Or they think in terms of assessment of an experience rather than an assessment of the performance. And so employers, one of the large influences behind why the National Curriculum Guidelines went to a competency approach is individuals wanted to know, the employers, what am I getting for this product? What does this degree mean? The licensing exams have changed. And the reason, as this cartoon shows, is we taught content, we assessed content, but we didn't say if they learned it and how they would apply it. And so that's the differences we think. So with this coming in these changes, it was a catalyst for our faculty and for our school. Actually, our mid-accreditation cycle is due in 2 years. And that now is like, okay, given these changes I talked about earlier, how will we capture this? I thought we had a slam dunk with our Doctor of Nursing practice. I really did. We had a standard size, standard syllabi. So everything that we wanted, including what assessments, how did it map to what course objective? We also had our learning management system is Blackboard currently. What goes where, how's it done, all of those things. We had curriculum mapping. I could tell you by every course objective what assessment it was being done and how it mapped to our program outcomes for our degree, how it mapped to the accreditation and to the specialty. Well, and within these, the courses can be shared. Well, here are the pieces. And why did, you may ask yourself, did we map at the course objective level rather than the course? Because in our field, we have content that is not in a particular outcome by the national guidelines. It can be what we call our threaded content or concept areas that are threaded across. If we were to map at the course level and not the course objective, we would not capture that. And again, not only is it important for student outcomes, but for accreditation. So here's what we found. It didn't work. We actually, through Chadia telling you that resource and others, we were able to move that. However, everyone thinks that ball is going to get up that hill or get thrown. Someone else will do it. Assessment, it's going to be, you can give someone a title and they will take care of it. You will have an evaluation committee. It becomes other. What we're talking about now when we think about complete learner record, it's everybody's understanding. Faculty have to understand what's happening in their course, what assessments are being made, how it maps to the other pieces. And that, to me, is going to be one of the biggest culture change. So I can't take my course and do what I want and just move on. But that also, as I think about a course, the assessment method and the documentation of performance for clinical, and even in nursing, we use a lot of simulation, whether it's standardized patient, virtual realities, some which are remote, some of which are on site. And for us, where we have an online program with on-site immersions, but clinical can be different, that becomes critically important about demonstrating. I've talked to you about the culture.
Rita, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to keep a check on time because we need to get to Paul 2. We're at 12:22 and we end at 12:30. So we might need to pick up just a little bit.
I will pick it up.
Sorry.
So the other piece that I will say is that in that sustained effort is dedicated time. I think we underestimated, at least I can speak for nursing, not only our instructional design staff, but myself, how much time this would take as you create these pieces. So for us, we wanted to say is why keep going? Why not just say thanks, but no thanks? And that's because we wanted to unlock our future. We must. The future is ours. I talked about the value differentiation, but also the collaboration allows us to chart paths together rather than alone. I'm going to, at this time, this is really the complete learner record that will be able to capture this. And the piece that I want to say, in higher education, there is a call for public accountability and a validation of learning. And so you've heard about that through a number of individuals. And as we think about credentialing and the badging, Janet uses a phrase that I like. Let's us develop the guardrails about what that will be. How do we know it? How do we say what it is and what it isn't? And there's not enough time here, but what I do want to say is, as we look at a complete learner record and what's behind it, here are some of the things that I found really useful. And there's a slide on outcome assessment. And so in that slide for outcome assessment, it gives us the opportunity to look at whether it's a course or term, whether it is a one-time or longitudinal. So we can look at cross-sectional longitudinal assessment of courses at the course or at the program level. And the last one is looking at that student performance, which is the next slide. And this one is the student level that you can see how are they doing at a program outcomes, at a course outcome. This was not really permissible before. And so with that, I will stop and take questions later and now ask my colleague, Paul Huddick, to talk about their journey at Whiting School of Engineering.
Thank you, Rita. Good afternoon, everyone. Just a disclaimer, since we're all working from home, my kids may walk through that door at any point. That's the first disclaimer. The second disclaimer is it's lunchtime, and so if you hear my belly grumble, that's what that sound is. I'll keep this short and sharp because I do want to have opportunity for you to ask questions as well. So I'm speaking from the Whiting School of Engineering. A little bit about my role. I oversee a center that provides instructional design, instructional technology, and media services to our faculty. Our our focus here, our superpower, using Janet's words, is that we don't really want faculty or anyone else we support to have to worry about the granular details. Specifically around CLR, we want them to get excited around the idea, but we need to make sure we've got the support mechanisms in place so that all of the back end stuff is done for them. So they can remain excited, they can remain focused on what their mission is, which is teaching and research, and we can do the other things. Collaboratively, when you have that, it works really well. Shadia, if you can progress to the next slide, please. So real quick context of the Whiting School of Engineering, we have 20+ degree programs in undergraduate, full-time graduate, and part-time and online graduate programs. We have this really exciting branch now to the Whiting School called Lifelong Learning. We've just hired an Associate Dean for Lifelong Learning who is providing strategic planning around this. I'm working very closely with that person as well as with the degree program heads to make sure that there's strategy around everything that we do. Shadia, next slide, please. So Janet shared this earlier. This was born out of the Whiting School. This is part of our strategic plan, right? We want students who come to the Whiting School to have this journey. It's called many things, as we know, right? It's called the 60-year curriculum. It's called lifelong learning. It's called professional education, whatever you want to call it. Everyone's gearing towards the same thing. right? Students enter your school, your university, and they have a roadmap to continue with you far beyond what they do in the undergraduate or even just their graduate degree. And this is what we're building, right? But to build these things, there need to be sound strategy. Otherwise, you're going to be recreating the wheel over and over again. Shadia? So with the right strategic and tactical planning, we have a solid foundation to help build CLRs. Again, this is focused around the idea that this really kind of student-centric thing, right, this CLR, which can be really valuable. Rita talked about this, but a value differentiator for students here and for the university is this idea of the CLR, but there's a lot that actually has to happen in the back end for this to become a reality, and I'll highlight some of that in the next few minutes. So this is kind of, this just reminds me of our world, right? When we have administrators, I sit in multiple places within the Whiten School, but you know, when we ask faculty to do something, you typically get this reaction, right? So, hi faculty, on top of your teaching and research load, we need you to think about how your learning outcomes align with competencies. And you typically get this response, is that, you know, I don't want to think about this, right? It's just not part of my job. It's important for everyone who's involved in this to recognize that, because nothing can move forward if you're asking faculty to think about this alone. You need to have the support mechanisms in place so that, again, they can stay focused and excited about the CLR. But the other things in the back end need to happen to make this all work. So the blueprint for the JHU CLR, I'll talk about the 4 things as Shadia mentioned. Shadia, you can just breeze through all of these. So you've seen this blueprint. I'll talk a wee bit about how we're approaching each of these individual items. Go ahead, Shadia. So when we develop competency-focused learning outcomes, one of the things we want to highlight here is every single course that comes through our shop has this kind of conceptual design phase we call the course design matrix. This happens at every single course, right? So we have course learning outcomes, module learning outcomes, all associated with specific things. This gives us the foundation then to build on, because we know, right, what students are expected to do in each course. Next slide, Shadia. We also then have this mentality within our group that we design once, deploy anywhere. This is very common in software, right? And we've applied it to our group. Design once, deploy anywhere means that if we build something for our undergraduate program or for our master's program, we should be able to repurpose that for something else, whether it's a MOOC, whether it's a small C certificate, whatever it may be. We need to be applying those resources to design once and deploy it in different places. We have assessment plans, as we've talked about, for every single program, which allows us to align our program learning outcomes to our course learning outcomes to actual things that students do, right? The assessments, there's that really clear alignment there. And we've got all of this built out in the system. We also use APHIS, this was referenced a few times in this presentation, but we also use APHIS as a syllabus management tool. So we've got all of these different places and pieces, right? We've got the syllabus, we've got the course design matrix, we've got the program learning assessment mapping, all of these things connected so that when we want to build something else, right, we can start with the learning outcomes, what are students expected to do? Do we have content already created there? And what competencies are the students expected to do and gain from this learning experience? And we can then think about that strategically about how can we repurpose something that's already built into something else. Go ahead, Shadia. And so ultimately, this is what we're all aiming towards, right? This minion is everyone now. It's everyone, it's faculty, it's instructional support, it's administration, it's everyone all pulling together so that this idea of the CLR can actually happen. But it takes a lot of work to get there. I encourage strategic and tactical planning of this. I encourage investment in instructional design and other resources to kind of help build these systems, these processes in place to make this a reality. That's it from me. Thank you.
Paul, you win the award for when we missed time a presentation and you brought up the anchor and really pulled it together in record time. Thank you for that. And, you know, apologies that we ran a bit over. When you get 4 academicians and faculty members, instructors to talk, we're not good at being brief necessarily. I know we had a couple questions that came up in the chat. We did, in case we ran short, plan some questions for you all, but clearly that's not an issue. There are things that we would be curious to hear from others, you know, how you're engaging with faculty and how different universities are envisioning using the CLR. The only other question I saw in the chat so far has to do with how do we eventually build an ecosystem across universities. And while that's a really aspirational goal, oh, holy cow, I'm not sure that's going to happen before I retire, maybe. But I think even just starting to have these kind of discussions in higher education are helpful. And I hope you walk away with, just the sense that I think we're really trying to voice the importance of bringing academic affairs and faculty into the discussion, because, without them, I just think the CLR discussion is going to fall flat and never really launch.
Great, thank you very much. This was a great presentation. I think we got to all of the questions mainly in chat about mapping competencies and connecting with employers. So thank you very much. Thanks for sticking with us these extra few minutes as we ran just a little bit long. I will follow up shortly with a copy of the recording. So if you're interested in sharing it with others, be sure to do that. We will do another CLR roundtable in late May, so look for that information as well. Thank you very much to the Hopkins panel for sharing your story. I think it really resonated, and the power of the academic side of the house in this type of initiative is important. So thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.